Hello again. Every year, about 10,000 new books of history get published in North America. And every year, about 27,000 history majors proudly receive their degrees from universities. And every year, millions of people watch historical programs and documentaries on TV. And all of these authors, students, and viewers of history are basically following a well-trodden path that's been established by previous generations, which defines what history is and what it means to write or to study it. But can you imagine being the very first person ever to write a work of history? To be the person who invented a whole new field of human knowledge and inquiry? If you were that person, before you could begin writing the first history book, you would have to come up with answers to 4 fundamental questions. And those are: 1. What exactly is history? 2. What are its purposes and goals? 3. How should one do research? And finally, 4. How and in what form should you present your findings and conclusions to your audience? These are exactly the questions that confronted the first people to write genuine works of history. And in this lecture, I'm going to look at 3 men who stand at the very beginning of the entire historical tradition. These are 2 Greeks, Herodotus and Thucydides, who both lived in the 5th century BC, and the first true Chinese historian, Sima Qian, who lived during the Han Dynasty around the 2nd century BC. Herodotus wrote the history of the Persian Wars, Thucydides told about the Peloponnesian War, and Sima Qian authored a comprehensive history of China up until his time. And by the way, the most famous part of that is our main source for the actions of the first emperor Shi Huangdi. In this lecture, I want to look at how each one of these 3 historical innovators answered those 4 basic questions about history. What is it? What is its purpose? How does one research it? And how do you write it? And the 3 of them came up with very different answers to those 4 questions. And the various approaches and methodologies which they created have continued all the way up until the present to influence the way that history gets written. All right, we'll begin chronologically with the earliest of these historians, Herodotus. He very helpfully begins his work with a sentence that directly addresses several of these questions. The opening line of Herodotus' history reads, "These are the researches of Herodotus of Halicarnassus, which he publishes in the hope of preserving for all time the memory of what men have done, so that the great and noteworthy deeds of both Greeks and non-Greeks shall never lose their proper glory, and to record here the origins of the conflict." The word in the opening phrase, which I've translated there as researches, is an ancient Greek word, historia. And at the time when Herodotus was writing, historia meant something like inquiries, or very literally questions that were asked. But it's usage in that very sentence by Herodotus that gave historia the meaning that it has today, an account of the past. So Herodotus is actually the man who invented the term history itself. Herodotus quickly goes on to delineate what his history will contain. He says it will be the great and noteworthy deeds of both Greeks and non-Greeks. In other words, he has decided to give a record not of everything that happened, but only what he considers the most important events, what he calls the great and noteworthy deeds. In addition, he states that his history will not just be the account of one group or people, but it will be a universal history, encompassing the actions of all nations. And that final little clause of that opening sentence, where he says, "and to record here the origins of the conflict," this adds an entire further dimension to Herodotus' definition of history. Because if you're investigating the origins of the war, that implies you're doing an analysis of causation. And so that clause takes Herodotus' history beyond just being a record or a chronicle of actions, because it suggests that he will also include interpretation of the events and how they relate to and affect one another. That same sentence also has Herodotus' ideas regarding the purpose of history. So for him, the main function of history is, as he says, to preserve the memory of what men have done. And so a historian, at least in Herodotus' thinking, is a recorder of important events, an interpreter of the past, and a preserver of glorious memories. This is one of my favorite opening lines of all time. In just 39 words in the original Greek, Herodotus not only invents the discipline of history, gives it its name, and offers his response to two of those big questions about it. There's one more little bit of information that's important in that opening sentence. When he identifies himself, he says, "I'm Herodotus of Halicarnassus." And Halicarnassus was a city located in Ionia. That was the region which, during the generations immediately before Herodotus, had been the zone that the Ionian rationalists had lived and worked in. And their ideas very, very clearly made a deep impression on Herodotus. Next, let's consider how does Herodotus conduct his research and gather information. Well, in keeping with the Ionian rationalist emphasis on personal observation, Herodotus traveled extensively. He went all around Greece and Asia Minor, visiting the various cities, but it seems he also went at least as far east as Babylon in the Persian Empire. He is also known to have traveled south to Egypt. It seems he went north up to Scythia, which was an area in southern Russia, and he even went west all the way to Italy. And in his writings, he carefully distinguishes between information that came from his own observations and that which he obtained secondhand from others. For example, at one point, Herodotus describes the pyramids of Egypt, and he lists their dimensions. Now, not content to just rely on what the locals told him, Herodotus explicitly tells the reader, these numbers are accurate because I myself crawled all over the pyramid and measured it. A final significant aspect of Herodotus' method of research is that he believed in gathering together all different versions of an event rather than just relying on one perspective. And this is really one of the most sophisticated and remarkable features of his work, that he would go to the trouble of seeking out and including alternative viewpoints. You can see this approach already on the very first page of his history. He begins with an examination of how the conflict between Greeks and Persians began. And he first presents an account of these incidents, which he learned from Greek sources. But then he goes on to give the reader the conflicting Persian side of the same events. And finally, he even throws in a third version, which was told to him by the Phoenicians. After having presented all these different accounts, Herodotus then inserts himself into this debate with a famous statement. He says, which of these stories is true or not, I cannot definitively attest. But I will, however, now proceed to identify who, according to my personal knowledge, was the person who first started this conflict. So, Herodotus allows the reader to evaluate each piece of information for oneself and to come to one's own conclusions. He also routinely gives his assessment of this material. And he doesn't hesitate to say, I think this one is more plausible than that one. But because he passes along not just his conclusion, but the raw data itself, he ultimately leaves the final interpretation up to the reader. The last question to be looked at with Herodotus is, how does he organize his history? And he likes to arrange his information thematically. So rather than, for example, listing events in chronological order, which might seem natural, instead, Herodotus will group together a bunch of little stories which all illustrate the same theme. Sometimes these may be an aspect of human nature or a certain type of event. And the stories, he'll often pull them from different cultures, different places, even different times. But they'll all be linked together by the way in which they exemplify or illuminate some concept or theme he wants to get at. And underlying that particular approach is his belief that there are certain grand, overarching themes that recur over and over again throughout history, and which really determine or guide the course of events. Two examples are he believes that history is always cyclical, and he also believes that fate often controls what happens. A final characteristic of Herodotus' style is the very way he has of presenting information as entertaining stories. So his history is not a dry, stuffy chronicle. It's engaging, it's lively, it's a narrative that's full of memorable characters and sort of amusing incidents. Herodotus is a storyteller, to the extent that sometimes his desire to surprise the reader with an unexpected revelation or to build up suspense will take precedence over chronology or even clarity. And it also means his work has a lot of descriptive details that sometimes are not always, well, directly related to the main topic. And he also tends to include a lot of myths and legends that obviously are not very true, or at least are of questionable veracity. An example of his love of telling anecdotes are several lengthy asides in which he digresses from the main historical narrative to offer what really are entertaining descriptions of strange foreign peoples. And sometimes these are called his ethnographic excursions. Typically, they will focus on the geography of a country and the culture of its people. Now, the longest of these is on the people, land, and customs of Egypt. And in a standard translation of Herodotus, this is over 100 pages long. So he goes into a lot of detail, if not always accurate, about the everyday life and habits of Egyptians. And his interest in writing not just about big political or military events, but also in capturing daily life, customs of different peoples. And that interest has earned him the title, the father of ethnography. All right, now let's turn to Thucydides, our second historian. He lived a little bit later than Herodotus, and he was a native Athenian. And during his lifetime, the long and bitterly fought Peloponnesian War had been waged between Athens and Sparta. And Thucydides was appointed to the rank of general in the Athenian military, and he was in charge of defending an important Athenian colony. Now, he turned out to be a terrible general. He failed miserably at that task. And so basically he was fired from the military and exiled from Athens. So, forced into early retirement, he decided to turn his energies to writing history, and to writing the history of the Peloponnesian War. Just like with Herodotus, the opening passage of Thucydides' work is an important one. So, his history of the Peloponnesian War begins. Thucydides, an Athenian, wrote the history of the war in which the Spartans and the Athenians fought against one another, believing that the war would be greater and more memorable than any previous one. The Peloponnesian War, if estimated by the actual facts, will certainly prove to have been the greatest ever known. Here, Thucydides both identifies the subject of his work and presents a justification for why these events are worthy of being written down. The passage also shows several of his core beliefs. Among them, that it's possible to identify indisputable historical facts. And he believes that it's possible to objectively analyze these facts and to draw concrete conclusions from them. So, Thucydides' definition of history focuses upon accurately recording facts and logically analyzing why they happened. Not surprisingly, his writing very heavily emphasizes the political and the military, and he has little space or really patience for the sort of colorful, fun little asides about people's private lives or the kind of ethnographic excursions that Herodotus indulges in. One interest that Herodotus and Thucydides do share is that they're both concerned with understanding the origins of events. And Thucydides' statement about this aspect of his work is very clear. He says, "What were the causes of the conflict I will identify first, so that in the future no man may be at a loss to know what the origin of this great war was." How did Thucydides do research and evaluate his sources? Well, he says that he's only put down either what he himself observed, so again, Ionian rationalism, or what he learned from others after what he says was, quote, making the most careful and particular inquiry, end quote. Now, in that passage and other places, Thucydides takes on the mantle of the expert historian, and he has supreme confidence in his own skills of critical analysis that he thinks will lead him to the correct interpretation. And he contrasts his rational and objective history with less reliable accounts written by other types of authors. And here he's implicitly criticizing Herodotus. He says, "My history is not intended to win popularity contests for its style, but rather it's to be a thing of permanent value." So, for Thucydides, the purpose of history is to provide an accurate account of the past so that people can learn from that to better predict what will happen in the future. In summation, Thucydides kind of makes the claim, reading my history may be boring, but what it gives you is the truth. Now, unlike Herodotus, Thucydides adopts a very strict chronological structure for his history. He proceeds with a rigid year-by-year account, and he describes events as they unfold. So there's none of this back and forth jumps around in time that we see in Herodotus. An even bigger difference between the ways in which the two men present their information is in their attitude towards citing sources. So whereas Herodotus always gives multiple versions and identifies their origins, Thucydides does neither. Rather than the multi-voiced, conversational tone of Herodotus, Thucydides' work offers, in its place, the confident, declamatory voice of a single, all-knowing authority. And Thucydides' justification for that approach is that he assures the reader that I've gathered together all the existing accounts, I've subjected them to my expert and rigorous critical analysis, and I've distilled them down to one version which represents what he believes is the truth. Now, in assessing Thucydides' claim to be presenting purely factual history, we have to consider an aspect of his work which is a bit controversial. He likes to give speeches that were allegedly given by various historical personages. And while Thucydides reports these speeches in direct quotations, he also admits that he invented most of their content himself. So he actually says at one point, I have put into the mouth of each speaker the sentiments proper to the occasion, expressed as I thought he would be likely to express them. And he often uses these sorts of speeches to incorporate elements of his own analysis or interpretation into the narrative. And so they serve an important function in the work, but they really are at odds with his supposed dedication to pure facts. Let's switch now from Greece to China. Sima Qian lived a couple centuries later, after Herodotus and Thucydides, and he was working without any knowledge of them. So he had to be just as much of an innovator as they were. As with Thucydides' failed generalship, the story of how Sima Qian became a historian is also a tragic one. Sima Qian's father had started writing a history of the world, but he died before he could finish it. And on his deathbed, Sima Qian's father forced his son to promise that he would complete this grand work. Sima Qian eventually becomes attached to the court of a Han Dynasty emperor, but through a long sequence of events, he ends up offending his employer. And so he's sentenced either to pay a big fine or to commit death by suicide. Now, he didn't have the money to pay the fine, so he should have just killed himself. But if he did that, he would leave his oath to his father unfulfilled. So, remember how important filial duty is in China. Bound by that oath, Sima Qian had to accept a truly awful alternative punishment. He was castrated. And at this time in China, castration was regarded as the ultimate humiliation. The poor historian described himself as being nothing more than, quote, a mere mutilated body dwelling in degradation, end quote. But this allowed him to live on so that he could write his history and fulfill his vow. And he ultimately died in obscurity. But within a couple generations, he became recognized and famous as the father of written history in China. All right, let's look at how Sima Qian answered those four basic questions of historical writing. And in some respects, he combines elements we've seen in Herodotus and Thucydides, whereas in other areas, he's really carving his own path. So, like Herodotus, his history adopts a broad, inclusive perspective. He describes both the deeds of great famous people as well as local customs, what we would call social history. Also, just like Herodotus, he personally traveled widely as a youth. He went to many different regions in China, gathering up information. And he uses and directly quotes from a very wide range of different types of sources. So he uses eyewitness accounts, he cites official documents, he refers to letters, songs, inscriptions. A major difference from both Herodotus and Thucydides, though, concerns the purpose of history. Whereas the two Greeks were fixated on trying to explain causation, why things had happened, why people acted as they had. This really didn't seem to interest Sima Qian very much. He was a follower of Confucius, and in his viewpoint, Confucius had really already provided a perfectly complete explanation of what motivated people and their actions. So for him to do that would just be redundant. Instead, Sima Qian concentrates not so much on the why of history, but the what. He focused on preserving the events of the past rather than trying to explain them. And again, and this is also in keeping with Confucian doctrine, he's most interested in recording examples of good and bad behavior in order to offer up admirable models for people to emulate and shameful ones for them to avoid. And this whole approach also meshes very nicely with Chinese ancestor worship, since an important familial duty was always to remember the accomplishments of your ancestors. So for him, the purpose of history was to promote moral behavior, like Confucianism, and to preserve tradition. When it came to the issue of how to write and organize his history, Sima Qian had a unique solution. His work combines some of Thucydides' chronological structure, but also weaves it together with Herodotus' storytelling. So Sima Qian divides up his history into 5 separate sections. The first two are called basic annals and chronological tables. And those give pretty much what they sound like, a chronologically arranged overview or survey of events, concentrating on rulers, wars, politics. The next section is called treatises. And like Herodotus, this offers thematic treatments of really all kinds of things. It's a mishmash of topics. He discusses water management. He discusses the economy. The final two sections are called hereditary houses and biographies. And both of those really present individual biographies of all kinds of different people and groups, ranging from emperors of China to assassins to cruel officials to wandering swordsmen. And within this whole work, the same person or event sometimes gets described in more than one section. So, for example, he tells about the actions of one famous general named Wei Bao. And he talks about this general in no fewer than 9 different places. And to really get the full story of Wei Bao's life, you have to read all 9 separate passages. Now, at first, this to us might seem a little awkward. But what it actually does is it allows Sima Qian to create a complex and a nuanced history. Those various different accounts are told from different perspectives, or are sometimes taken from totally different sources. And so even though the stories are sometimes inconsistent or conflicting, they offer multiple perspectives. The overall effect of this is similar to what we saw in Herodotus, where he gives multiple perspectives of events which he has drawn from different sources. Only instead of where Herodotus directly juxtaposes those contrasting versions, Sima Qian chooses to give them to the reader in discrete locations. And just as Herodotus would often end one of his sections with his own interpretation, Sima Qian often concludes bits of his work with the same sort of analysis. And you know he's beginning one of these because he'll often preface it with a kind of third-person phrase where he says, "The great historian," that's him, "remarks," and then he'll give his opinion. So in their methodologies, we can see Herodotus and Sima Qian both grappling with the problem of historical complexity. And how do you represent that to a reader? Sima Qian's approach, in particular, seems more confusing than that single authoritative narrative voice of Thucydides, but what it also does is allows a lot more psychological richness in the way he depicts characters. Sima Qian was a real innovator, particularly in his use of biographical history. And fully 70 out of 130 chapters of his work are just straightforward biographies, and this is quite innovative. And that approach naturally lends itself to vivid storytelling. So, like Herodotus, Sima Qian is famous for colorful and entertaining stories that he tells. Also like Herodotus, Sima Qian includes mythical legends in his work. And a final similarity that they both share is their insertion of what we would call ethnographical sections, where they describe the strange customs of foreign lands. And while Herodotus includes, let's say, his famous excursus on the customs of the Egyptians, he also has ones on the Persians and the Scythians. Sima Qian gives a very lengthy account of the odd habits and distinctive culture of the nomadic horsemen who live on the Mongolian steppe. And this was a group a little bit mysterious called the Xiongnu by the Chinese. On the other hand, in the manner of Thucydides, Sima Qian's history has a number of famous speeches that are given by historical figures. And again, just like Thucydides, he seems to have invented the text of many of those himself. Herodotus, Thucydides, and Sima Qian represent the beginnings of what is today a long tradition of historical writing. So they began this 2,500 years ago. It's still ongoing today. And those basic questions, what is history? What are its goals? How do you do research? And how do you write it? have provoked innumerable answers over the ages. But the three initial paths blazed by these three great historians have all remained incredibly influential. And each approach continues to have, today, its adherents and its detractors. And whether you favor the approach of Herodotus, Thucydides, or Sima Qian is quite honestly, to a large extent, a matter of stylistic preference. In the end, all three histories and all three historians have a lot to recommend them. And looking at how each one grapples with those eternal issues regarding the writing of history is an enlightening thing and an enjoyable experience. Thank you.